Winston, why don't you kick us off? Who are you? And then I'll move over to Cliff and we'll do the same.
So Winston Elliott, I'm from Houston, grew up in Houston, went out of state to Georgia for college and went on an Army scholarship. So then I was in the Army for a little while after that, lived all over the country. I tell people I got to spend my 20s jumping out of planes and blowing stuff up, and I really had a good time. But then
hurting your knees as well.
Yeah, hurting my knees as well. But then ended up getting out of the Army, starting a family in Houston, going to Rice for business school, which I really enjoyed. And we were kind of speaking about it earlier, but I went into strategy consulting immediately after Rice, and have kind of since, was at a previous employer and then now here at Lockton, moving into kind of the people space, partly because I saw, one, it was an interesting niche that I didn't feel like was totally being addressed, not just from a benefit standpoint, but just from what we call like people strategy. And then also just, we've kind of discussed some of it, but having my own family and the impact that some of our decisions can have if we do a good job, I think really impacts an employer and employees and families in a meaningful way.
Yeah. Well, Cliff, why don't you tell us who you are and some of your background, and then we'll pick it back up here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. First, thanks for having us on.
Of course, man.
Your podcast is one I religiously listen to. I like it quite a bit, and a lot of your guests are very interesting, and I like what you're doing.
Present company included.
Yes,
of course. Well, yeah,
absolutely.
This is obviously the best podcast
so far. Biggest viewership.
We're on it as the best podcast.
Yeah.
No. So, Cliff Favors. I grew up in Indiana, Midwest, joined the military like Winston. 9/11 was my senior year of high school. So again, pretty big impact on me and my trajectory as an adult. Did that for 14 years. Got out in 2018, met my wife, had my children during that time. Moved all around the country, saw a lot, did a lot. It was a good time, just like Winston. It was a blast. It was probably what I needed to be doing at that age. It was fantastic. Got out, moved down to Houston. First time I've ever really been to Texas or lived in Texas. It's phenomenal. I love it. We fell in love. Within 6 months, we're like, oh, this is home.
And I feel Houston, though, is one of those cities that feel like it's a take it or leave it. Like some people are just love obsessed Houston. Some people are like, I would never live in Houston. It's too hot or whatever the excuse is. So what is it about the city that both of you guys sort of gravitated to?
So my wife's Korean and Puerto Rican. We love food. The diversity here of thought and experiences. I mean, it's as good or better as New York City or any major metro that you can think of. The food here is great. The experiences my kids get are phenomenal. I don't think you can see that anywhere else. And I mean, I grew up in a small town in Indiana. Like I can speak to that. It's leagues different than what I grew up with. So it's just, and then it's also very friendly to veterans, just Texas in general.
Oh, absolutely. And I know you guys hear this a lot, but of course, thank you guys for your service as well to this country. I always appreciate getting to talk to veterans. Transition from the military, civilian life, like whether advice or your experience, I'd love to kind of hear what it was like to leave that world behind and enter this world. I know you're still in the reserves, right? But like what you would say to folks that are considering that, if there's anybody in the military that's listening, or what you kind of learned through that transition that you would want to share.
Yeah, you might. I'll just go first, I guess. But I mean, I think that one of the bigger things, it's kind of freaky to people. I think that it's taking that step out. There's plenty of people who are like, okay, I want to get out of the military. But then when all of a sudden now you're out trying to figure out, we had a little bit of I don't want to say easier, but a different path where like, it sounds like you had a job pretty much lined up pretty soon after. I went right out of the military, right into business school. So I had kind of an avenue that I was going to figure out my corporate life or whatever. But it's kind of scary. One thing that I found that was super helpful to me, and what I would tell other veterans as well, is you're not going through it by yourself, and to reach out to whatever city you're going to. So, again, we're big proponents of Houston, and the Houston veteran community, I think, is probably the best in the nation. Of course, not biased at all, but but I reviewed a bunch of resumes. I still review a bunch of resumes. I still have conversations with guys and gals that are getting out who are like, hey, what do you want to do? And then we connect them with people who are in that industry. So rather than saying, hey, I think I want to go into finance or whatever it may be, we're basically saying, hey, talk to someone who's done that for a while and get an idea of what it's like, because I went to a couple of things where they're like, what's the difference between an investment banker and an investment manager, which is basically like a wealth manager? And they asked a room of veterans whenever we were in business school, and I think one person raised their hand out of 20 something.
Yeah.
And but like, why would we know the difference, right? Just like we would say the difference for different military jobs, and people wouldn't know that. So I guess long story short is to say, like, you're not going through it by yourself, and to reach out to others who've kind of been there ahead of you, and maybe see like, hey, maybe I need to touch up my resume. Maybe I need to understand how my military experience, because a lot of people come out like, well, I was a leader. And it's like, that's great. But you led people who were legally obligated to do what you had to, you told them to do. So how do you lead when people aren't, legally obligated to do what you have to say? So
yeah. What about you, Cliff? Any perspective you want to add to that?
I would just piggyback. The biggest and most useful tool a veteran has in getting out is that network of veterans who have already walked that path. So reach out. If there's an industry you think you want to go into, reach out to people in that industry. We're all willing to help, which is what I found.
Absolutely.
I wouldn't know anybody if they had a unit in common or a friend in common. Just reach out. 99% of the time, they're over the moon to help you, solve a life problem.
Well, I don't know if it's universal, but I would say this industry, I've noticed, is very, very willing to help. Like, it is literally just an ask away for most of the time. And even people that are very seasoned and very high up in leadership and positions, if you just ask a question, most of the time you will get an answer. You will get real good advice as well.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that is unique to the benefits industry, if that's maybe just Americans in general. I don't know. But this industry seems to be very, very helpful, especially.
Well, so you kind of touched on it. So military, we talked about it earlier. I believe if you're in the military, you have a predisposition to service. And this industry is not unlike that. It's one, a big problem that needs solved. Two, it's a problem of service to people. How do we take care of families? How do we keep businesses in business? How do we do that? So it's very aligned with that service mentality, I believe. And I think that probably is part of your point right there, is everybody in it is generally in it for the right reasons, which means they're willing to help.